And action! All right, Kelly had a question about carbohydrate addiction, so I'm going to try to explain what happens, and maybe if you understand it better, you might be able to fight it faster or stronger. So check out my video on DrRic tutorial glycemic index. It might give you a little idea about how this reaction comes about. But I went ahead and drew the graph that I have on the other video. This is the amount of measured sugar in the bloodstream. This is the time that goes by. So with regards to carbohydrates, carbohydrates can essentially be broken down into low glycemic and high glycemic. I think that's the easier way versus simple and complex. But low glycemic carbohydrates are good. High is bad. Don't get high. So low glycemic index foods are essentially what Mom used to cook from scratch. Took a little bit of time, everybody chipped in to make cut the vegetables, to simmer the stew, whatever. But that stuff is healthy. When you get anything that's highly processed in a bag or at a fast food restaurant, that's highly processed and high glycemic, that's unhealthy. And I'll tell you why. So if you look at the speed at which a low glycemic index food group gets absorbed into the bloodstream, it peaks at about 100 over the course of a couple hours, and then it slowly tapers off. Now, how does it peak? Well, it takes a little bit of time to digest. Think of old-fashioned bread, pumpernickel bread, something that's really hard, and you gotta work on it. Or for that matter, pasta al dente, the way it's supposed to be eaten in Italy. It's chewy. Americans are used to soft pasta. Melt in your mouth, you suck the needle in, and one chew, it's already dissolved, and you bite it and you swallow it and you're good. Well, if it's harder to chew, it takes a longer time to digest, whether it's in the mouth or in the stomach. And it takes a long time to digest. That's actually good. That's what the human body's used to. And over the course of time, insulin will be secreted because as this digestion occurs in the stomach, once it liquefies and turns into basic absorbable macronutrients, it then crosses the stomach and the small intestinal wall to be absorbed into the bloodstream. Once it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, then the body or pancreas senses it's there, and the insulin is secreted from the pancreas to get the glucose into the cell to be utilized by the cell for energy. So once it's digested, pancreas makes insulin, the combination gets into the cell and it slowly dissolves and goes away. Pancreas slowly makes a little bit of insulin, pancreas slowly stops making insulin. That's what and here is what happens with this red mark. This is what happens when you have something that's highly processed. You don't even have to chew it. As I mentioned, it's soft, it's easy to digest. White bread, it goes straight into the bloodstream from the stomach, fast, and peaks more than 100. So it peaks, and then because the body detects it, the pancreas sends out a ton of insulin to match this peak. And because the pancreas sends out a ton of insulin at one time, in a stressed out kind of state, the insulin and the sugar that just got put into the bloodstream now go away. They get tucked away into the cell real fast. Because having too much sugar in your bloodstream is irritating to the blood vessel. So we got to take the sugar out of the bloodstream into every cell you can. That's what happens when you first start having diabetes. But anyway, with all that insulin that was just made by the pancreas or the insulin overcorrects. And even if the pancreas made a lot of insulin, it got all the sugar away, but there's still insulin around, so it makes you hypoglycemic. It makes you crave stuff. When you're hypoglycemic, you have no sugar at all because of too much insulin being secreted. And you start to get the craves, you start to get irritable, you start to get hungry, you start hunting for the same fast fuel sources, carbohydrates, bad carbohydrates, so you can re-up again. The brain likes to have this stuff around, so it's been shown in some small studies that a part of the brain here called the nucleus accumbens, it actually lights up when people have high glycemic index foods. This nucleus accumbens also lights up with cocaine and drug abuse. So there is an addictive quality that's associated with the high you get from high glycemic index foods or carbohydrates. So that's where it usually comes in. And again, the idea is that if you can avoid the high glycemic index foods and stick with low glycemic index foods, pancreas doesn't have to work that hard. Blood vessels don't get shocked into saying, oh, there's too much sugar around. And every cell in your body works better. Because this is what happens initially. Soon what happens after you just keep on showering the bloodstream with sugar every day, 3 days a week, 365 days a year, 3 times a day, 365 days a year, and years at a time, well, the cells defend themselves and they don't let any insulin or sugar in. That's what I did down here. Here is a hallway full of a bunch of teenagers. And usually at first, if the school opens up in the fall, all the teenagers are in the hallway. And what do? They get into the room. The bouncer lets them into the room, teacher. And usually the hallway's cleared. Because you can't have teenagers sitting in the hallway. They'll destroy the lockers, they'll muddy up the floors, get them in the seats. So what happens after a while, though, is sometimes if you just have too many kids in the hallway, the bouncer, even if there's a key to get into the door and to the room, the bouncer will not let the kids into the room because they'll destroy the room. That's insulin resistance. After a while, the cell will not let the sugar, even with insulin, into the cell anymore. It just keeps it in the bloodstream, and that's irritating. That's when you stick your finger and you have a sugar of 200 or 300. That's way too high. That's because these guys are floating around in the bloodstream. And that's because even with the key, even with insulin, the door and the bouncer don't listen anymore because they were trying to protect themselves. Well, that's the good protective mechanism, but this cell needs energy. So what happens when the cell needs energy and doesn't get it? Well, the brain doesn't work right, brain fog. The muscles don't work right, weakness. The hormones don't work right, testosterone deficiency, estrogen deficiency, thyroid. Everything doesn't work right. And then there's other things that happen, but I'll leave that for a later discussion. So that's essentially what happens when you have carbohydrates shower the bloodstream too fast, and usually in the form of high glycemic index foods. Before it used to be called simple sugars. You shouldn't eat that many simple sugars. You shouldn't eat sugar anyway. But read labels, because even my guys that avoid sugars or putting extra sugar in their food or coffee or creamers, there's still sugar in a lot of processed foods, so you have to be good at reading labels and knowing how words are disguised. So that's one way of trying to avoid the carbohydrate reaction is if you actually eat a food group that's a highly processed, high glycemic index group, if you get it into the stomach, sometimes even if you have no choice and you're at a party, the thing you can do is you can throw fiber into the mix. If you dump fiber in there, extra fiber in addition to your crappy food, it sometimes will neutralize it, because what happens when you have fiber, even to crappy food? Like I told you, the fiber makes the bolus of food or the glycemic load tougher to get absorbed into the bloodstream that fast. So fiber, that's why high fiber diets are very helpful. Not only for your poop, but they also keep the glycemic load low. So those of you who think you're doing a high fiber diet, it's 30 grams at the least that you should be taking in per day. Most of my patients come in, even if they're vegetarians, at about 15 to 20. Push the envelope with fiber and you'll have overall lower glycemic load. And that will help with slowing the absorption. The other thing that helps with slowing the absorption is protein. If you indulge in more protein than carbohydrate, you'll have satiety, so you won't have that crash later. And it'll take a longer time for this bolus of food, this meal that you just ate, to be absorbed into the wall, into the bloodstream. So protein, I like to push protein, sometimes 30 grams per breakfast, 30 grams per lunch. It is a lot, but you're allowed to do that. And again, the information out of Canada is great. Higher fiber foods if you can, or just high fiber supplements of varying degrees. It's been said that those of you who take probiotics, you can take the probiotic, but you really need varying sources of fiber. And if you have a plethora of different colors on your fruits and your vegetables, perfect. But keep on pushing fiber. You just have to watch that gut, because sometimes you have to get used to the first 2 weeks of high fiber diet. You'll be passing a lot of gas and a little bloated. But stick with it and you'll probably get through that. The other thing that obviously helps with addiction, if you cannot avoid, you go to a Filipino party and you have to indulge and you have to be respectful, you have to eat what they give you. Sometimes what you can do, what I do is, you can be there and share in the time of the feast, but it's hard to fight. So you prepare by doing the prep before you get to the party or before you indulge. So if you're thinking you're going to crash at 3 o'clock, sometimes instead of going with a high glycemic index food that'll make you crash faster at 3, it'll make you hungry, make you tired. Sometimes if you keep a low glycemic index food, like I mentioned, a meal at 12, it'll be protecting you at 3 or 4 when you crash. You can also chew slower. There's stimulants that when the stomach fibers get stretched out, ghrelin gets secreted to the brain, leptin gets secreted or stops its secretion from the fat cells. So leptin and ghrelin are 2 hormones that play a key role in giving you satiety to the brain. So that's, again, with taking your time and chewing properly. Usually if you take your time and after feeling 7/10 full, it's called hara hachibu in Okinawan, after feeling 7/10 full, if you just wait a little bit, it'll take a little bit of time, but eventually the ghrelin, about 10 to 15 minutes, the ghrelin signals to the brain will start to say, oh, I'm full, versus you going ahead and indulging in the second or third plate. It's a technique that's been practiced in ancient cultures, but we don't do that because we're always in a hurry with eating. And when you're in a hurry with eating, you don't let the signals from the stomach get to the brain, and you actually wind up overeating. So taking your time and chewing. I think the Seventh-day Adventists have a technique where they chew a certain amount of chews per food or per mouthful, and I think it's a good practice. Again, being mindful with your eating is a good practice versus just standing up, eating on the run, eating in your car, eating when you're stressed out, or eating food from somebody else who cooked that was stressed out. That's not energetically healthy, according to ancient cultures. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of an idea about what happens when you have the bad carbs. And if you do have a little bit of an addictive reaction to your carbs, try to balance your carbs out with fiber, protein, or try to shoot for a lower glycemic index. And you can find different websites that show you all the glycemic indices for different food groups. You can also add Whole Foods. They actually have Furman's Mandy and Andy score. It's another different form of measurement by Joel Furman. But if you go to the shelves at Whole Foods, I think they still have them labeled, so you can take the guesswork out by just going with the best form of the score. So good question, Kelly. Don't forget, if you like this, you can comment and we can share a little discussion on what you think. If you don't think or agree, that's fine. If you do agree or you have any other questions, then post them. I'll try to get to them as best as possible. But subscribe to me and Dr. Ric's Minute Clinic for the next question.